The Nintendo GameCube has always been my favorite console growing up. It was the first console that I could call my own, and it gave me some of the most memorable experiences in my gaming history. Whether it was sailing Hyrule for the first time in Wind Waker, competing against my brothers in Smash Bros. Melee, or experiencing Resident Evil 4 for the first time. These games and many others like Twilight Princess, Metroid Prime, Super Mario Sunshine, and Resident Evil Remake are often cited as the best games on the GameCube. And rightly so. They are all amazing games. Some are even considered masterpieces. If I were to ask you what your top GameCube games are, more than likely these games would be on your list as well. But what if I told you that there is another game that deserves to be at the top as well? One that you might have forgotten about. I'm talking about the often overlooked Viewtiful Joe.
Oh, me? Viewtiful Joe.
This game is amazing. I remember being 11 years old and going over to my best friend's house. He showed me this new game that he just got, and the cover art instantly stood out to me. I had never seen anything like it before, and I was excited to see what the game was all about. After a few hours of playing, I was hooked. I went home, and I knew that I had to get my very own copy. So folks, today I want to take a closer look at this simple yet creative game and talk about why it deserves to be considered one of the Nintendo GameCube's greatest games. I am the Legendary Eddy, and 20 years later, let's put on our V-Watch and let's tension a go-go baby into the beautiful world of Viewtiful Joe. Right off the bat, Viewtiful Joe makes it clear to the player that it isn't going to take itself too seriously. I won't go over every level in detail. Instead, I'll talk about the first level of the game and how it introduces the player to the gameplay mechanics. I'll also talk about some of the final levels to explain what makes this game so great. The game begins with Joe and his girlfriend, Sylvia, at a movie theater, watching an old Captain Blue movie. Joe has clearly seen this movie before, but still, he refuses to let anything distract him from his viewing experience. Not even when his girlfriend tries to spice things up with a little action. Joe denies her like an absolute Chad and insists that the movie is more important than getting laid. Suddenly, Sylvia is dragged into the movie screen by the villain of the film, and shortly after, Joe is dragged in as well. The screen fades to white, and we are introduced to the first level of the game. The story itself doesn't really get any deeper than that, honestly, but that's really all we need to know. We have the setup, and the stakes are obvious from the short intro. It's the classic Save the Princess scenario we have seen hundreds of times before. Viewtiful Joe was never meant to have a complex story. But what makes Viewtiful Joe different is that our protagonist is in on the joke. He is aware that he is in a movie, allowing the game to be self-aware enough that it can focus on the three main things that make Viewtiful Joe what it is. This game was made with three things in mind: art style, gameplay, and difficulty.
Time to go to work, guys.
Viewtiful Joe looked amazing back in the day, and still looks amazing today. From the moment you first see the art cover, you know that this game is going to feel and look like nothing you've played before. This is all thanks to its unique and creative art style. It's presented in a cel-shaded comic book art style that stands the test of time. Add onto it the film elements and the over-the-top animations, and we get something that is instantly recognizable and timeless. Like the Wind Waker on the same console, the cel-shaded cartoon look doesn't have to look realistic. Instead, by focusing on its creative art style, we are left with something that is going to look great even 20 years later. If this game came out as an indie game in 2024, I think people will still give the art style and graphics the same praise they did as when the game originally was released. The art style not only looks amazing, but it fits the tone of Viewtiful Joe perfectly. Joe is self-aware, confident, and bold. All this is reflected by the style of not only the art and design, but by the gameplay and fighting as well. The colors are vibrant and bold, just like the characters. The music is energetic and catchy, just like the combat. Every element on screen is presented with one word in mind, and to me, that word is style. If you ask me to think of a cool game, Viewtiful Joe is the first game to come to mind. Everything from the art style, the humor, the fighting, and the main character himself have a sense of style and coolness that is hard to replicate in any form of media. The character designs all take inspiration from classic monster and kaiju movies from the past, but with a modern and vibrant twist. The art style tells the player what kind of experience they are in for. A damn good time. And none of the presentation feels forced or like it's trying too hard to be cool. That's mostly thanks to Joe himself. Like I mentioned before, the game doesn't take itself too seriously, and our protagonist plays the part of the hero with a sort of fun and funny detachment from the situation. In fact, later on in the game, he admits to having so much fun that he totally forgot that he was supposed to be saving Sylvia all along. And that's what I love about this game. The art style and presentation are reflected in the characters and narrative, and vice versa. Having that clear vision with art direction and style benefits not only how the game looks, but every other element in the game as a whole. I loved how this game looked 20 years ago, and I still love it today. As I've mentioned before, one of my favorite things about the game is how self-aware it is, and how that blends into the story and gameplay itself. Joe is excited with his current situation. He goes along with everything with charisma and excitement, almost as if he's been waiting for this exact scenario to happen, and now that it has, it's finally his time to shine. Joe has been transported into the world of cinema, and with this, the game can capitalize on creative freedom. I knew I wasn't going to experience some cinematic, genre-defining epic, and that's okay. Viewtiful Joe was made in a time when a video game can just be a video game. A lost art in this day and age. After that short introduction, we are presented with our first taste of gameplay. A small tutorial where we learn how to dodge enemy attacks and land a few attacks of our own. If a skull appears above, we duck to dodge. If a skull appears below, we hold up to evade. Doing so successfully leaves the enemy dizzy, leaving them open for us to attack with ease. If you want to get more comfortable with the gameplay, you can stay here for as long as you want. Once you move on from the tutorial, the game begins. Viewtiful Joe plays as an old-school side-scrolling beat-em-up game. You defeat enemies along the way, solve puzzles, and collect these V-reels that are scattered throughout each level. Most of the time, there is a counter at the bottom right corner of the screen telling you what you need to defeat in order to move ahead, and these V-reels increase your VFX bar. Each 50 you collect unlocks another section of the VFX bar, giving you more time in VFX mode. Now at this point in the game, that doesn't really mean anything, but as you punch and kick your way along, you eventually come to the second tutorial of the game, fighting Captain Blue himself, the star of Joe's favorite movie series. He tells you that you have not yet learned how to properly use the power of the V-Watch, and you must challenge him in a duel. Once you beat him, you unlock the true potential of the V-Watch, and by saying the magic words given by Old Blue himself, Joe finally becomes the hero that can save his princess in distress. He becomes Viewtiful Joe.
Head to the go-go, baby! You want some? We'll come and get it.
Now, this is where the VFX bar comes into play. Now that you unlock the power of the V-Watch, Joe has the power of movie special effects. Slow motion, Mach speed, aka fast forward, and the close-up. The first one we learn is slow motion. With slow motion, you not only see enemy attacks coming a lot easier, but you can dodge them as well. And combining a perfect dodge in slow motion lets you blast dizzy enemies across the screen, dealing increased damage to other enemies in the process. Call it old-fashioned, but at the time, slow motion was an awesome mechanic to have in a video game. It might be overplayed now. After Joe transforms into his superhero form, you notice that the screen is no longer fuzzy or blurry. This is because in Viewtiful form, Joe is no longer an outsider in movie land. Instead, he is the hero of the movie. Therefore, the picture quality is nice and clear. Also, when you overuse your VFX bar, Joe reverts back to his human form, and the image becomes blurry again. It's a small detail, but I always like that added touch. With the basics out of the way, we're ready to move forward with the first level, fighting mini-bosses and solving puzzles along the way. Each puzzle requires use of one of Joe's powers. Each power affects Joe's fighting and affects its environment as well. For example, slowing down time makes water drops larger and heavier, while speeding up and attacking makes Joe catch on fire because of the blazing speed, while also basically cloning Joe, allowing him to hit multiple targets at once. This first level introduces you to the game world and gameplay perfectly in my opinion. Each lesson learned will help you throughout the game, either in puzzles or, more importantly, in boss fights. Figuring out how each special power affects things on screen is vital to mastering the game's mechanics. Eventually, we make our way to the first real boss of the game. Meet Dark Fiend Charles III, a vampire who gives us our first hint as to why Joe and his girlfriend were dragged into this movie land. If you have been collecting the V-Reels, then your meter should be either full or almost full by the time you reach a boss fight. Trust me when I tell you, you're going to want as much VFX bar as you possibly can get. If you have gotten used to the mechanics by now, then this boss should prove pretty easy. Just slow motion uppercut these stones that fall from the ceiling towards Charles and beat him up however you like. Just be sure to dodge his attacks and use slow motion freely here. After a few cycles of this, he should die pretty fast. And with that, the first level is complete. Afterwards, you are given a rating for each segment of the level, with the colorful V being the best rating you can get. In between levels, we can spend our V points to upgrade Joe with new abilities and attacks, or for more lives and hearts. This level teaches the player to the basics of the gameplay mechanics, and sets up how the rest of the game is going to play out. Most puzzles in each level will give information to the player that will benefit them in boss fights later on. They get more complex as you go, but each level plays almost the same. Collect V-Reels, solve puzzles, defeat multiple enemy types, and also try to remember anything new that might be useful for the boss fight. Pay attention to your surroundings. See a box in the background you can't hit? Use Mach speed on something and one of your clones will hit it for you. A projectile is flying towards you? Use slow motion to hit it back to an enemy. It's these lessons that the game teaches you that when combined together makes what seems to be pretty simple gameplay mechanics actually be pretty complex when it's all mixed together. You can combine different combinations of powers, giving you the freedom on how you want to deal with the challenges you're presented with. And there are more abilities you can unlock to add even more weapons to your arsenal of fighting. The deeper you get into the game, the more complex progressing through the levels becomes. But with all the powers and abilities, and the mixing and matching of them, makes what seems like very basic gameplay be actually pretty deep and complex when it's all said and done. If all this sounds like a lot to remember, don't worry. It all becomes muscle memory eventually. Mostly due in part because you will be replaying these levels a lot, not just because it has insane replay value. No, you will be replaying these levels and be forced to learn these lessons because of this game's difficulty. And holy shit, is this game difficult. Which brings me to the next topic, the difficulty. This game is going to kick your ass. A lot. You will hear this over and over and over again, time after time. In fact, when looking up posts about this game, a lot of people actually just gave up on it. Multiple posts of people complaining that they couldn't finish the game and found it not fun because of how hard it is. Some even go as far as to call it unfair. And yes, this game is hard. It kicked my ass a lot. Some parts made me quit in rage. And even for this playthrough, 20 years later, With all my years of gaming experience, it still beat me down regularly. But although I don't want to be that guy to use this phrase, I have to be. This game is hard, but it's also fair. Like I said earlier, each level teaches you lessons that you need to memorize. Most of the time, for the boss fight at the end of the level. This game rewards you for playing calculated and precise, and punishes you for button mashing your way through the game. Even in the first level, we quickly learn that just mindless punching and kicking isn't going to work all the time. Just like any difficult game, if you keep dying in a certain spot, try something different. See which powers work best against different enemy types. If you're stuck on a boss, memorize its attack patterns and find a way to counter or evade each attack. Is this sounding familiar to anyone else? All this is to say that although this game is really difficult and punishing, I don't think it warrants people quitting it outright. Trust me, if you can beat Dark Souls, you can beat Viewtiful Joe. Unlike other difficult games, Viewtiful Joe isn't unfair or cheap with its difficulty. No enemies can one-shot you, and every enemy and boss have a way to defeat them if you are patient enough to figure out how. Remember to dodge attacks and make enemies dizzy. Too often I caught myself just trying to brute force my way through a level and dying because of it. This game will punish you if you button mash or only use slow motion for every encounter. Each special move and power has its place and time to shine. It's up to us to figure out when and where to use them. It's still not going to be a walk in the park, but by memorizing this game's mechanics, enemy types, and patterns, we get to appreciate how deep the fighting mechanics actually are, and it starts to make sense why this game was made with difficulty as one of its main elements. It's like when you play Bloodborne for the first time, dying over and over again to Father Gascoigne, but by the time you start New Game Plus, you can typically beat him up on your first try. That's the same feeling you get when you master Viewtiful Joe's mechanics. It's difficult, punishing, but rewarding as hell. And going back for a second playthrough, even with a higher difficulty, you will see that although it's still challenging, your mastery of the mechanics starts to pay off as you move along faster than you did the first time. So to those that gave up on the game because of how hard it is, I suggest giving it another try. Don't treat it like a regular beat 'em up game. This game is a lot smarter than that. Treat it as a challenge you need to respect in order to deserve victory. And if you want a tip that will help you out in most situations, use Joe's Red Hot 100 punch with slow motion. That's a close-up punch while in slow motion. It will make this game a lot more manageable. But you didn't hear that from me. But even with that, I will say that the final two levels are some of the most difficult levels in gaming I have ever experienced. Level 6 being a boss run, where you have to beat even stronger versions of every previous boss back to back in order to move on, leading up to what I think is the game's second most difficult boss, Inferno Lord Fire Leo. And level 7 being an absolute gauntlet where the creators decided to throw everything plus the kitchen sink at you. I mean, there's really no room for error in this level if you want to make it to the game's final and by far the most difficult boss, Captain Blue himself. This boss fight is so intense that the battlefield is literally the entire globe itself. I mean, you can't get any more hardcore than that, can you? But even with these two extreme examples, with enough patience and pattern recognition, you will be so hardcore and badass by this point that you will not give up until you hear those sweet, sweet words of victory. Finished. Without the difficulty, Viewtiful Joe would not be the same game. It's as vital to the game as the art style and direction are. It's one of the reasons why it became one of my favorite games of all time. At 11 years old, it was one of the first games that truly challenged me, and that's something I'll never forget. Without the difficulty, there is no Viewtiful Joe. It would be some other regular beat 'em up game, and that's not what this is. This game, with its difficulty, is what made it so memorable, and what made it so impactful. If you're still interested in the story, it turns out that Captain Blue is actually the director of these films and the creator of this movie land, but somehow he got trapped inside his own creations. Since then, he has been working with the Jado crew, which are the game's bosses, to find a way out by using his daughter, who turns out to be Sylvia.
I was wrong.
Daddy, don't be silly. You could have abandoned your ideals and ended up disillusioned and hollow like an empty shell. At least you followed your dream. I thought it was a great movie. Just think of all the fans waiting for your next production. You can't disappoint them.
Oh, Sylvia.
Look, Blue. Everybody loves a happy ending.
After a touching moment, alarms go off, warning us of an impending alien attack. Joe gets ready to fight once again, but this time, Sylvia asks her father for her own V-Watch to help Joe fight. After transforming herself into her superhero outfit, Joe and Sylvia are ready to fight side by side as they pose for the camera, and the sequel is set up.
Viewtiful Joe and Sylvia!
The credits roll, and afterwards, we're treated to a music video featuring Joe as one of the leading members. It's random as hell, but damn it if it isn't a banger. And that's all. After completing the game for the first time in Adults mode, we unlock an even more difficult setting called V-rated mode, as if this game wasn't hard enough already. But this adds to the game's replayability, as well as unlocking new playable characters. The first being Sylvia. If you manage to beat the game in V-rated mode, you unlock Ultra V-rated mode, the game's most difficult setting. That is only for those who have mastered and memorized the game's mechanics and enemy patterns by heart. But beating each mode unlocks even more playable characters. You can challenge yourself to see how high you can go in difficulty, and each character plays different for a different experience every time. And for those that want an extra challenge, you can try getting the highest rating in every level. All this makes Viewtiful Joe instantly replayable, which is great because the game is relatively short if you only go for one playthrough. But I recommend doing multiple playthroughs and trying out different characters. In doing so, you become better and better and better at the game. And who knows, you may even be good enough to handle Ultra V-rated mode. Viewtiful Joe stands out to me as a gem in the early 2000s gaming landscape. I didn't know it at the time, but this game was directed by the legendary game director Hideki Kamiya, who directed other games such as Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry, and Okami. So it makes sense that Viewtiful Joe debuted to critical praise from critics all around, which is why it surprises me that so many people I ask about the game either don't remember it or have never even heard about it, which goes to show that just because critics and websites give a game high praise doesn't mean that everyone is going to hear about it. But 20 years later, I still love this game. It isn't a perfect game by any means, but it always held a special place in my memory for how fun and unique it is, and for how it didn't hold back any punches when it came to the game's gameplay and difficulty. I feel like if this game were made today, studios would force the developers to make it easier for a wider audience. Thankfully though, Viewtiful Joe was made when studios gave developers the freedom to create what they wanted to create. If you've never played it before, I can't recommend it enough. It was made in a time when studios were releasing bangers after bangers. That time seems to be replaced with a time when games have unsustainable budgets and every AAA title has to be a masterpiece or it's considered a failure. It may be the case that with so many classics and masterpieces surrounding it, Viewtiful Joe is often overlooked or forgotten about. Because back in the day, games were being released by people that had a vision in mind and executed that vision as perfectly as they could. And even 20 years later, Viewtiful Joe is an amazing example of what that vision could do. Thank you all who stuck around for this video. I'm currently working on more videos on the games that I grew up with, and also doing a separate series on more current playthroughs. If you haven't yet, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Any support right now means so much, and I will continue to improve with each upload. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, I am the Legendary Eddy, and I will see you legends later.